welcome and thank you for clicking on the video, much appreciated. This is another in an ongoing series of videos that I'm going to be doing on 40-hour gameplay reviews. And today we're going to be focusing on Going Medieval, which is an early access game released into Steam in June 2021. Now I do appreciate that because it is early access, the gameplay is going to change, but I'm going to go over what it's like to play the game right now. So why do a 40-hour gameplay review? It's quite simply because I figure 40 hours is a solid working week, and that's a pretty fair amount of time to invest into a game to get a good feel for it. And just if you're wondering, there is the proof. And if you do like this sort of in-depth and, well, relatively well thought out review, don't forget to hulk out on that sub button and tickle that little like button as well. Respect to you if you do. So I'm going to break this quick review down into 4 parts, and if you want to jump forward to those bits in this video, it's down on the YouTube timeline and you can skip ahead. I'm going to be going over to start with the basics of the game. Then I'm going to talk about the good stuff, then the bad stuff, and then I'm going to give you my overall opinion of it. And that really is going to come down to what did I feel like the game offered me, and what did it feel like to play the game. That's all it's going to be. I'm not going to be giving it some dramatic rating or anything like that, but I'm going to tell you what it's like after 40 hours invested in this game. But let's start off with the basics. Going Medieval is currently on Steam for about US $22, New Zealand $31, and well, the rest you can work out for yourself. The developers say this about the game: you will stake your claim in this colony building sim and survive a turbulent medieval age. Construct a multi-storey fortress in a land reclaimed by wilderness, defend against raids and keep your villagers happy as their lives are shaped by the world around them. So sometimes the developers will oversell their games in those Steam descriptions, but this one isn't too bad. I would describe the game as, yes, a colony building sim where you will construct a base of some sort. You're going to have to defend against raids, and you're going to have to keep your villagers happy, and yes, their lives are shaped by the world around them. So that wasn't a bad start, because the actual Steam description given by the developers is quite accurate. Overall, the user Steam reviews give it a very positive rating. And flipping through a few pages of those, most of the reviews are done after about 10 to 20 hours of gameplay. And yet again, just to point it out, it is early access, and the developers have put up onto their Steam page a roadmap, and you can see there's a lot of really interesting things that are to come, and if they get implemented properly and maybe in a timely fashion, this game could really flesh out. Going Medieval is a isometric castle city building game, I guess you would call it, where you start out with a few settlers, and then from time to time a settler is going to wander into your little realm. And this person will normally be an escaped prisoner or some similar such thing from some other settlement close by. And you always get the choice as to whether to allow them into your settlement or just ignore them. Now, for the most part, you're just going to bring them in, and if you agree to that, then a few days later, the rather annoyed settlement they've left will then raid you unless you give the person back. And that's the sort of fundamental dynamic of that part of the game. The objective of the game, as far as I could tell, was really just to build a big settlement, recruit lots of people, unlock all the new technology, and make everyone happy whilst repelling invaders. It's overall pretty standard fare for this type of game, but I couldn't really pick that it had any unique objective that set it apart from anything else. The good stuff. The seasons and their timings is really quite a good feature of the game. And as you know, you have 4 seasons, and each is, in this game, 12 game days long. They are long enough these days that you get things done, but not so long that the days drag on. But the seasons, they're all quite unique in their own way. So for example, if we were to pick winter, which is the one that you most worry about, it is really cold, and when you have cold snaps in particular, it really affects your gameplay. Typically in winter, none of your crops are going to grow, so you have to ensure that for the previous seasons your larder or your stocks are really full, or else your poor little settlers are going to get very, very hungry in those very cold, long days of winter. And the seasons feel well balanced. I quite liked it, and the impact on the gameplay is really nice. It was well worked out. Similar to the seasons, you can have random weather events, in particular the summer and the winter, where you can have a heat wave or a cold snap, respectively. These are really well done. They affect your gameplay in quite dramatic ways, including things like in the winter when you have a cold snap, you have to lock your doors and keep your settlers inside, because if you don't, well, that tree that you ordered them to chop down, they'll go out and chop it down in minus 30 degrees Celsius and just fall unconscious on the ground. And well, you've got to respect their work ethic, but it is a really nice extra weather dynamic that's well done. The building mechanics in the game work well. They seem to be logical and pretty easy to figure out, and it doesn't take long for your little settlement to start looking nice, and you can start to see how if you put a bit of time and effort into it, you could make them look fancy. Although it is a little bit limited in what you can do at the moment. I assume that this might be expanded a bit in future updates, but at the moment it works really well for what it is. Another thing I liked in the game was item deterioration. Everything that you have, if you leave out in the open in particular, will deteriorate. This occurs mostly when you leave them on the ground and exposed to the elements. Now, I watched no videos prior to playing Going Medieval, and this particular mechanic was something I found had quite far-reaching implications, but these were good implications. I really had to start to manage my starting resources, items, and in particular food, of course. And with no air conditioning, well, I worked out that to store items, well, you need to dig down into the cool earth to make underground cellars. Item deterioration had it had a really fantastic effect on the game, and it forced me to think, and it forced me to constantly modify the structures and improve them, in particular to ensure my precious food stocks would last through winter. And I thought that this mechanic was exceptionally well implemented. Now, without going into details, I will say that the UI itself, the overall UI, the interface that you're working in, was clean and really easy to use. I had no issues with it. Everything was quite straightforward. I managed to figure it all out for myself pretty quickly without having to refer to any other videos or helps or tutorials. It was well done, to be honest. Another thing that worked really well were the settlers themselves. When you start the game, you get to choose which settlers you want. Each one will have different skills, different levels in those skills, and they'll also have certain little characteristics. And these can be quite dramatic on the way the settlers behave. One of them I really noticed was one of my little chappies liked to get up early and go to work, and they were always up early and off they went to work before anyone else, and that was just a nice little thing in the game. But I guess when you combine the settlers and their skill sets and the way those skills improved over time with the job schedule system and the work prioritization schedule system, so to speak, it all fleshed together nicely, and your characters, your settlers over time really started to feel like they had personality. You felt like you got to know them. And I guess that's a really key thing in one of these games, is that you feel some sort of affinity and attachment to the settlers. And I did. I mean, we're not perfect, but I felt like I knew these little fellas. Like all games like this, early access in particular, it's not always all good. They sometimes have some problems as well. So here's some of the bad things that I noticed in the game. One of the objectives of the game is to influence your region. And if you jump into the region tab, you can see how you are doing in that space. But as it stands right now, I can see the other settlements, but it all is rather meaningless because it just says I have 100% influence, which was pretty easy to get. But so what? The other settlements are just dots on the map. They do nothing and I do nothing for them, so you do not feel any connection at all to the greater world. Now, looking at their roadmap, I know they are going to fix that, and that would be really good, but at the moment it feels really lacking. And getting closer in, not just the regions feel a bit lacking, but the starting map feels pretty lacking as well. The map that you start in is, well, dull. It has resources that you need, trees and animals and other bits and pieces, but it isn't really much more than a simple block. Now, why does this matter? Well, when the world around you in one of these games feels a bit empty, you don't look out into the world. You don't see what's happening in the world around you. You just look in. Now, this may well be a deliberate design choice, but it leads to what I would call a disconnect with what you are building with what is around you, and that was a little bit of a sad face for me. Now, the settlers themselves, I've already talked about that there's some good parts to them, but there's also some bad parts to them as well. The animations of the settlers are pretty simple. There's nothing too dramatic about that, because I'm one of those players that loves to see my settlers doing things. I love to zoom right down and actually see physically what they are doing with whatever item they're working with and their interactions, but there really isn't much to see and it's a little bit boring. And moving directly on from that, well, the AI of everything in the game is basic. In particular, the settler AI is very task job orientated, which makes for a world where things get done, but they just don't interact with the world around them. They don't stop to look at that shield that you put on the wall. They don't get pleasure from that nice layout that you've put, that nice courtyard or that garden. Because if your settlers go idle, they just wander around like some sort of car crash survivor or something, and yeah, it makes them feel a bit shallow. Although the pace of research and its respective unlocks was good, the unlocking system feels a little bit trivial. For example, you unlock archery and now you can make a bow, but when I plonked down the workbench and saw that it literally was all I could build now was a bow, it felt flat for me. I was hoping for a little bit more. So the research seems really pedantic, a little bit slow. Now, if you cast your mind back to the beginning of this video, you'll realize that this game talks a lot about surviving raids, surviving the enemy that will come to take you on. And it has a big problem here. It really does have a big problem. The enemy AI is diabolically stupid. They have very, very basic, fundamental pathway, not problems. They just always go to, for example, the front door. Or if you have a trench built around your base, they will only go to that little tab of land that you leave open. Therefore, it is the easiest thing in the world to defeat your enemies, because you just layer that one funnel of access with traps and make it difficult for them, and they've really got no way to get around it. So I found that even when I was getting quite substantive raids, it didn't feel like a challenge at all. Even when they brought a couple of, I guess you'd call them catapults along, it was really, really shallow, and that was a big problem. After about 40 hours of gameplay, I'd had enough because it offered no more challenge to me. Lastly, my overall opinion, and keep in mind it is just my opinion. If you're more into these types of games than I am, then you may get more pleasure out of it. If you're not, you'll probably get less pleasure out of it, but it's just my opinion. This is a good game. In fact, some people might say it is very good, but for me, I will probably settle on just a good game. Now, I know it's got a lot of YouTubers' attention, a lot of people have really enjoyed playing it, and that is absolutely fantastic. For me, the test for games like this is how often or how quickly I start to use that fast forward button. Now, I would say after about 30 to 35 hours of the game, 80% of my game time was in the fast forward mode. Now, that's easy for me just to say that, but we should always ask, why was that? It was because I just wanted to move the game along. And why was that? I got a little bit bored and I wanted there to be another challenge because the game became quite flat for me. But let's face it, I've actually paid bugger all money for this, and for what I've got out of it and the enjoyment that I've received from the game, and I think other people would receive from the game, it's really great value. It has a good future ahead of it. The roadmap is really going to flesh out a lot of the gaps, I suspect. So keep in mind that if you watch this review, it is done in July of 2021, and this game will be quite different in another year's time. But this is the state of the game at this point in time. Well done to the developers on putting out a solid little early access game that is fun to play, but just needs a little bit more fleshing out, which I think they're going to do, and then they'll be away up and running with a really fantastic game. Thank you for watching. Much appreciate your time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and perhaps I'll see you in the next chapter.